How many Game Pass subscribers are there? We may not ever really know. Last year, Microsoft said, hey, don't judge us by our console sales, judge us by how many people are subscribing to Game Pass. And so that kind of makes sense, right? Game Pass is Microsoft's future, at least that's the way they look at it. Their games as a service model, subscriptions, Microsoft loves that sort of thing. They do it all across their company, so it makes sense to judge them on that performance. Now, Microsoft has been relatively quiet for a company saying, judge us on this figure, about actually announcing that figure. We've seen, a smattering of growth over the years, and right now the official figure is 25 million. But this last week, a lot really kind of got thrown into the blender, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with the strategy that Microsoft is taking here, but let's just kind of dive in while something just doesn't quite feel right. So this all kind of got kicked off with a blog post, or a LinkedIn profile, I shouldn't say a blog post, where an individual listed that there are more than 30 million Game Pass subscribers. So that is a pretty big deal, right? That's something to celebrate, considering the fact that Microsoft's last public figure was 25 million. So a growth of 5 million on a reoccurring basis, that is some real dollar dues that are starting to add up. However, that number did not last very long because, the press picked it up, and then Microsoft very clearly reached out to this individual and they updated it to the last public figure of 25 million. Now, is 30 million the right number? I tend to think it probably is. We've heard this number been tossed around before. It feels like we're getting close. It's probably either close or it is accurate. We don't really actually know because Microsoft doesn't give us a daily update on everything, but that is the reality. But what if I told you it doesn't really matter? Like, this number is about to explode, and it's not because of Starfield. So other numbers that Microsoft has given us. So earlier, I believe this was back in January, could be a little bit off on that timeline, but I think it was from calendar Q4 of last year. Microsoft says, hey, there are 120 million active Xbox users. Now, don't get that confused with meaning there's 120 million paying users. Clearly, they paid for an Xbox, likely in some regard. We don't quite know. That could be PC, but either way, Microsoft says, hey, look, there's 120 million. And the number people wanted to know then and still today is how many Xbox Live Gold customers are there? Well, of course, Microsoft being Microsoft, they don't like to break things out. So I tried to really dig in and figure out, hey, what is the number that Microsoft is actually telling us? They've never, to my recollection, actually come out and said in recent history how many Xbox Live Gold customers there are. The best number that I've seen tossed around, and I don't like this number at all, is that Microsoft at one point said only 50% of Xbox Live users pay for gold subscriptions. And you're like, well, Brad, that's pretty easy. If we make the assumption that roughly that percentage holds true, then it should be about 60 million Xbox Live Gold subscribers. However, if you look at the blue highlighted text there, that statement was from 2010. So it is nearly 13 years out of date. I'm not saying that it's not 50%. In theory, it could be higher, it could be lower. I suspect that it's probably lower because you got to remember back from 2010, now the PC side is available, right? There's mobile with Game Pass, there's mobile with streaming. And so that number, in my opinion, is likely high. I don't have a great guess, but 40, 30%, but that's really just kind of plucking numbers out of the air. But let's just go with 30% because that would mean that of this figure, and you're about to question how I came up with this, would mean about 30 million users, right? But you're going to say, Brad, you've already just told us that 30% of 120 million is not 30. However, we know that the Game Pass subscriber number is somewhere in that 25 to 30 million. So being a little bit generous and giving Microsoft a little bit credit that the number's slightly higher than that, that would put it about 100 million users are not paying for some sort of Game Pass thing, and which means that 30% would be about 30 million gold users. It's really hard, and these are extremely rough numbers. I have to be very, very, very transparent with that. So knowing that we're somewhere around that figure, when you see what Microsoft is doing here, it gets a little dicey. So Microsoft announced this past week that Xbox Game Pass Core is now available. And if you're not familiar with Core is the new Xbox Live Gold. So what does that mean? That means that everybody who is an Xbox Live Gold payer or customer or repeating payer is now a Game Pass payer. It is in that bucket, is in that model. So does that mean, roughly speaking, that by making this one simple branding change, that they just added 30 million new users to Xbox Game Pass, to that figure? And technically speaking, yes, they just did. By rebranding Gold to Xbox Game Pass Core, that is exactly what they just did. And it feels a bit sketchy because Microsoft, more than likely, would not surprise me, at some point is going to come out and show a huge number. And by all means, they really could. I mean, what if Microsoft came out in October, as an example, and said, look, we now have 65 million Game Pass subscribers. Everyone would be like, wow, Brad, that is crazy. Look, Starfield did it. Look what Starfield did for Game Pass. Now, don't get me wrong. Starfield, I fully believe, did increase the number of Game Pass subscribers. I really do. But it did not increase it by 35 million-ish, something like that. Microsoft will likely tout that number because what they do, they slammed Gold into Game Pass, and which, again, I'm not saying was a bad maneuver. Like, from a branding and marketing perspective, it makes sense, right? It's a cleaner SKU lineup. You have Core, you have Console, you have PC, and then you have Ultimate. It makes more sense from a technical sort of like logistics perspective because Gold had sort of outlived its life in the new modern Xbox era. However, we need to be extremely skeptical about what Game Pass subscribers actually mean. And Microsoft made it a little bit trickier too. And I've got a theory, and I don't know if it's correct. But remember, with Game Pass Core, you get, Microsoft said initially, you'll get 25 games as part of Game Pass. But they actually, I think, launched with 36. Something like that. However, like, true to the word, that makes it truly a Game Pass subscription, right? Because you can access these games as long as you're paying. I really hope, and I mean, friends, I really hope that Microsoft management isn't doing this to hit some weird internal metric so that they can get their bonuses, right? If Xbox says judge us by our Game Pass subscriber count, and all they did was really combine Gold with Game Pass and rebrand it to hit those metrics, I hope the Microsoft board sees through that and does not reward that type of behavior because they didn't truly get growth. Now, granted, I would like to think that the leadership at Microsoft, especially on the board, is smart enough to see through that, and they're not just going to reward that, and that was sort of an expectation, because in reality, Microsoft should have broadcasted that, at least when they were aligning these metrics towards compensation, that this was going to happen in the year ahead, and so that it would sort of nullify it, and that the growth should be based off of the launch of Starfield, and should be launched off of Forza and other titles, and potentially the Activision acquisition probably plays into that somewhere along the way. So when you see numbers like 25 and 30 million, like that number is already outdated. That number was outdated as of this week based on the maneuvers that Microsoft has done with Xbox Game Pass. So that is why when people were rushing to write about these numbers, I wasn't like jumping on a video. It's like something just feels off here because, yeah, that number makes sense, but at the same time, it's completely outdated. And so the point of this video is that we don't really know the Game Pass subscriber counts. We don't know how Microsoft is going to position the next broadcasting, or sometimes they call it a PR moment of these numbers, because whatever it is, it's going to be bigger than that 25 number. We already know that. They clawed back the 30 amount, but that was probably just to align to corporate messaging at the end of the day. So there you go, friends. 25, 30 million. We don't really know how many Xbox Live Gold users were there. We don't really know. Probably won't ever know unless it leaks out many years down the road, and maybe we'll get some bit of information about, hey, you remember when we did that cutover, we actually absorbed X amount of users. I would love to think that Microsoft would clarify all of this during potentially an earnings statement, because that would be the logical time to do that, to educate their shareholders about what these numbers mean and how they work. However, Microsoft has a very rich history of not providing these numbers. Think about the last time Microsoft shared Xbox Series S and X numbers. I'll give you a moment to think about that, because the answer is you don't know. It only came out through an accidental leak, and we still don't really know the breakdown between Xbox Series X and S. Obviously, we think the S is elevated over the X, but we don't really know. Microsoft wants us to judge them on the Game Pass subscriber numbers, so potentially we might get a breakdown, but do you really think that Microsoft, after not telling us really any information about Xbox Live Gold, very little about the breakdown of Game Pass subscribers, really we just get a raw number, do you really think they're going to come out and say, okay, folks, here we go. We have X amount of users in Core, X amount of users in Console, X amount of users in PC, and X amount of users in Ultimate? No, Microsoft would never get that detailed. And it's a disservice to what they've been telling us to judge them off of, but Microsoft at the end of the day is so incredibly large with their market cap and how much money they make. This is a non-material number at the end of the day. And so technically speaking, they don't have to, but when you tell somebody to judge us by these numbers and you're not willing to give more information, it just doesn't kind of sit right. So this isn't intended to be a negative video about Xbox, by the way. Some people will probably interpret it that. It's more from the business side of Xbox, which is what I love. And I love the maneuvering. And honestly, slamming Core into the Game Pass lineup is actually a brilliant internal move because it really does inflate those numbers. It makes you look better than you are, which is all of what business is kind of about these days. So, right? There you go. Anyways, my friends, that wraps it up. Make sure to keep it subscribed here because the only BS on this channel is me.